Welcome everybody. In this video I will show you how to solder properly, and we will have a look at soldering PCBs or LED strips.
The video is suitable for beginners and advanced users. Take 10 minutes and I promise you'll definitely find one or two tips that you didn't know yet. Let's get started. To solder electronic components or fine cables, you can use a fine soldering iron that has around 16 watts. A soldering station is a bit more luxurious. You have the advantage that you can usually set and regulate the temperature precisely. A reasonable rest for the soldering iron is also included. Soldering stations have around 70 to 100 watts. Such a 100-watt soldering iron is unsuitable for electronics. The soldering tip is coated. You must not scratch the surface, otherwise it will become unusable. If the tip no longer accepts solder, it's time for a new one. Use a damp sponge to clean the tip. I strongly advise against using steel wool like this, as you'll only scratch the tip. Use fine electronic solder with integrated flux. Please check out our online shop for very good products. The soldering iron is around 300 to 400 degrees hot, so make sure you don't hurt yourself. The hot solder can splash or drip, especially if you use too much solder. By cleaning the soldering tip regularly, you can prevent solder from dripping down. If you have to work overhead or in an inaccessible place, simply put on safety glasses. I once wanted to reach for the soldering iron and then picked it up by the hot end instead of the handle. I burned my hand really badly. So you should always work slowly and with concentration. Set up the soldering iron safely and avoid tripping hazards with the cable. Keep flammable items away from the soldering iron. When you're done working, don't forget to turn off the soldering iron. For example, in our workshop, we have a timer on the soldering station for safety reasons. If you forget to turn it off, the whole thing switches off automatically after a while. The temperature depends a bit on the soldering and what you want to solder. I set my soldering iron to 370 degrees, which works quite well in most cases. When soldering, two materials are bonded together. This is similar to glue, but the extremely tight bond between the materials is achieved by melting the solder. If you solder too cold or too short, the solder joint will not connect, hence the name cold solder joint. If you solder too hot or for too long, you will eventually damage the components. It shouldn't take longer than about 5 seconds to complete a solder joint. If you are practiced, it can usually go faster. Semiconductors, such as transistors or LEDs, are particularly sensitive. So, you shouldn't solder for too long, but you shouldn't move the soldering tip too close to the components either. The radiating heat can also destroy your electronics. Simply turn the board around so that the soldering iron cannot damage the components. With LEDs, it is possible to destroy the semiconductor chip with heat without you noticing it immediately. The LED will initially light up, but will later fail. For example, after a few weeks or months. If you don't manage to solder something together within 5 seconds, take a break and let everything cool down before you try to continue. The electronic solder I use essentially consists of tin and flux. The flux is inside the solder and helps you to soldering. The flux is used up within a few seconds, which means that if you take too long, the solder will not longer work well and processed like chewing gum. If this happens, you can try to remove the old solder and add fresh solder again. Now you've learned the basics. Let's get to soldering. It is important that the components are well fixed and cannot move. A foam pad can help with the circuit board. If the components move during soldering, the solder joint will crack and become unusable. Always clean the soldering tip at the beginning. Old solder residues always cause problems. Then you tin the tip with a tiny amount of solder. This helps to heat the solder joint properly. After tinning, you have to work quickly so that the flux doesn't run out. Puts the soldering iron on with very light pressure. You have to heat all the parts you want to solder together. With this circuit board, I have to heat the soldering pad and the soldering pin at the same time. Now comes something very important. Don't push the tin onto the soldering tip, but rather onto the soldering pad. This will give you feedback. The soldering point is hot enough. As soon as the solder melts on the pad, you know the spot is hot enough. Once the solder starts to melt, wait a little while to make sure the tin flows everywhere. When the solder stops moving, you're done. Use as little tin as possible. The whole thing takes about 3 seconds. Heat up for the first second with light pressure. Add solder for the second second. Wait briefly for the third second. Done. Now remove the soldering iron. When you're done, your soldering point should look something like a small Indian tent. If it looks more like a ball, that indicates a cold solder joint or you used too much solder. Long wires are cut off above the soldering point. Do not cut into the solder joint, as it can break. To solder cables, I recommend that you tin the soldering points beforehand. This makes it much easier to solder the corresponding parts together. By tinning, you may need a little more working time, but the actual soldering time is shorter, which means you can connect the components together gently. As already learned before, don't forget to clean the soldering tip regularly. Then tin the tip again. Here I use a little more solder and then quickly connect the components together. Finally, an extra tip. If copper does not solder well, it may be because the areas are oxidized. Here you can use a dry cleaning block to polish the contacts bright before soldering. The cleaning block is similar to an eraser and has the advantage that it does not scratch the surfaces. I'll show you an example here on an old 1 circuit board. I have now polished the spot on the right, and you can also see the color difference. After polishing, the soldering pad easily accepts the solder.
Now you have learned everything about soldering. If you like the video, please subscribe the channel. This helps us really to produce more videos like this. Thank you for watching. See you next time.